I bring on my two guests today, Kelly McNamara, who is the Senior Policy Advisor and Research person at Friends of the Earth, and Monique Mikhail, who's the Senior Program Manager at Friends of the Earth. Thank you both for being with me today. Let's get into the data. I'll let you share it, although if you listen to this podcast on a regular basis, folks, you know that I quote this stat all the time. But please tell me, what were the results of this study?
Absolutely. So zooming back out a little bit to the first part, we actually found that there are 58 U.S. banks that are providing financing to these 56 meat, dairy, and feed corporations. And that collectively is a staggering $134 billion in financing between 2016 and 2023 that they provided to fund the expansion of these corporations. This financing led to over 63 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in 2022 alone. So to make that like crunchier for people, it's equivalent to the emissions from approximately 14 million cars driven for a year. That's the same number of cars registered in the state of California. So this really highlights the significant environmental impact of the bank financing of this sector. Bank of America, Citigroup, and JP Morgan Chase then emerged as the key players in financing of those 58 banks. They were collectively responsible for over half of the U.S. bank financing of the meat, dairy, and feed corporations, which is why we ended up dubbing them the Big Three and focusing our efforts on engaging those specific banks. I think most importantly, I think the real central fact of the report, which we found, which even we were quite shocked by ourselves, was that the lending from these Big Three banks to the meat, dairy, feed, and food processing and agri-commodity corporations that we reviewed in the report represents a tiny fraction, just 0.25% of the Big Three loans outstanding, but actually roughly 11% of their reported financed emissions. So it's like 0.25% of their portfolio and 11% of their emissions. So it's a massively outsized impact on their emissions compared to their actual portfolio. So the emissions footprint from financing these companies, that's a 44 times greater impact than the proportion of the bank's lending portfolio, which is pretty staggering. We also then looked at who were the biggest climate culprits that they were funding. And the meat giants, food processing corporations, and agri-commodity traders that supply animal feed are the highest emitters among this set from the Big Three. And specifically, Cargill, ADM, Bunge, and Nestle accounted for the bulk of financed emissions. And then Nestle, Cargill, and ADM accounted for the dominant shares of facilitated emissions. And really interestingly, Bank of America should take note that their underwriting of JBS alone accounted for 87% of their facilitated methane emissions. So just the financing going to JBS has a massive impact. So to us, the conclusions just really jumped out as very clear. For the Big Three, curtailing support for meat, dairy, and feed corporations would affect only a tiny fraction of their portfolio, but result in significant reductions in their financed emissions and enable major progress towards their climate commitments. So it's one of the most climate positive choices that the banks could actually make to curtail the finance for this sector.
Let's get back to the actual results here. This quarter point is producing 11% of the carbon footprint as reported by these top three, that's Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America. So my question to Kelly, and chime in Monique as well if you would like, why would they put themselves at this kind of risk? These are publicly traded companies.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, frankly, we have that question ourselves. And I think that part of the answer is that there's a lack of awareness of just how much these emissions are contributing to the bank's footprints. I mean, Citi themselves has said that it's too complex to calculate the agricultural emissions. Monique and I would say, well, we did it. So that's frankly our response to that. But there hasn't been attention on the sector. And I know this is coming up. We had COP28, it's rising to the surface, et cetera. But for so many years, I think as we know, it's been creeping up the agenda, just hasn't been on banks' radar, so they haven't had to address it. So I think that their investment in the sector has just been a business as usual, diversified portfolio, opportunistic sort of routine investing. And so I think a big piece of this is education, is calling it out. And this is why this report, this is why the campaigning, this is why this is so helpful to be on your podcast and reach your listeners. And so to help them just raise awareness, to call account for the reasons, exactly the reasons you point out. These are publicly traded companies, the banks I'm referring to. They have an obligation to shareholders. They have an obligation to their shareholders' diversified portfolios that are going to be at risk because of climate change being driven in no small part by industrial livestock. So that's my high level answer.